You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is John Ferling, Professor Emeritus of History, the University of West Georgia, and best-selling and award-winning historian of the American Revolution. Professor Ferling taught numerous courses on the Revolution, America's founders, and U.S. military history. He is the author of 13 books, of which I have 8 of them, all but 2 of which have dealt with the American Revolution and its leaders. Last but not least, he is a lifelong fan of the Pittsburgh Pirates baseball team. His latest book, Winning Independence, The Decisive Years of the Revolutionary War, 1778 to 1781, is the main topic of our podcast conversation today. It is available on Amazon and numerous other book-selling websites. It received significantly positive reviews in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Journal of the American Revolution. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Your book is terrific. There were a few things that really made me think, some points that you made that I had never really pondered, and I'm not sure how many books I've read on the Revolution and its leaders / participants. I would guess 50-ish. And there were quite a few, and I want to talk to you about them specifically and how you came to those conclusions. But let's get right to it so that we can maximize our time together. If you watch boxing matches, as I'm sure we both did in our youth, when boxing was actually popular and people watched it, there was something called the tale of the tape, where the strengths and weaknesses or attributes of each side of each boxer were often put on television and discussed. So what would be your tale of the tape between the colonists and Great Britain as the war began in 1775?
I would add a third figure in that tale of the tape, and that would be France. I think if the French hadn't come in, America could just never have won this war. That was the crucial thing. The French added strength and supplies and ultimately a navy to help the Americans. And without French support, the Americans would not have gotten independence.
But there's no, if you had to defend your PhD dissertation and the subject of defense was the colonies had a better chance to win the American Revolution militarily than the British did to win the American Revolution militarily, could you defend that thesis?
No, I don't think so. I think the British should have won the war or could have won the war in 1775 or 1776 or 1777. I mean, the Americans didn't have trained, experienced officers. They didn't have an army. They weren't very unified. Didn't have a history of being unified at any rate. Didn't have a navy. Didn't have manufacturing capabilities. So they had really a lot of things going against them at the outset of the war. And the British, I think, just thought it would be an easy go. They couldn't imagine the Americans putting up much of a fight. And in the discussions in London, when the Lord North's ministry was deciding over the winter of 1774-75 whether to use force, I think the general attitude was maybe one battle and it would be over. So the British were a bit careless at that point. And I think I mentioned a minute ago that I think the British could have won the war. Let me mention a couple of ways that they might have won the war in 1775, the first year of the war. General Thomas Gage was the commander of the British Army in America. He was also the last royal governor of Massachusetts. And Gage told London on more than one occasion, look, if you're going to go to war, you've got to send a lot of men over here. The British only had an army of about 7,000 or 8,000 men in all of America, and only about 5,000 in Boston when the war began. And Gage was telling him, look, if we score just a decisive victory over the Americans in the first engagement, that'll probably be it. A lot of the Americans had reservations about whether they could win a war against a major foreign power like Great Britain, and just a colossal victory would I think probably have ended the war. But Gage did not have enough troops. He just had too few. And the result was on that first day of the war out at Lexington and Concord, and then as the British Army retreated back to Boston along Battle Road, they just got chewed up by thousands of American militiamen who had turned out. So that was one place where the British might have ended the war at the very beginning. And 2 months later, in the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, Sir Henry Clinton, who was one of the three major generals in the British Army in Boston, outlined a plan using the Navy, the British Navy, to cut off the retreat of the American fighters atop Bunker Hill. And if the British had done that, they probably would have scored a bloodless victory. And I think the psychological impact of that all through the country, where people wondered whether the Americans could put up a fight against the British, would have been devastating. Many people would have probably just said, this is futile. Let's throw in the towel. And instead, Clinton's plan was rejected, and the British marched right up the hill to an entrenched American adversary. And they really marched into hell, is probably the best way to put it. Israel Putnam, one of the American generals, not at Bunker Hill, but he was at Bunker Hill, but it was a year or so later that he made the comment, if you put American militiamen behind a barricade, they'll fight all day long. And he meant by that they would fight resourcefully and they would fight well. And that's exactly what the militiamen atop Bunker Hill did. They couldn't fight all day long because they ran out of ammunition, but they fought long enough to mow down almost 1,000 British soldiers, and about 40% of all of the British officers in America were wounded. So again, I mean, here were two engagements within 2 months of one another in 1775, in which the British might have won the war. And in New York, by this time, General William Howe had replaced Gage as commander of the British Army. And he was just a lethargic general, overly cautious and not eager to move, and essentially he had Washington's army trapped on Manhattan. Washington had Howe moved very quickly. He could have sealed off all the exits from Manhattan. Washington's army would have been trapped and doomed. And if the Americans had lost the Continental Army on Manhattan in September of 1776, this war would have been over. And then finally, again in 1777, the British came up with a plan. They were going to invade New York. General Burgoyne was coming down from Canada. And the question was, what would General Howe, who was in New York, do? And if Howe had come up the Hudson River to link up with Burgoyne as he came down, catching the Americans in a pincers, I think the British could have destroyed the American army at that point. Certainly Burgoyne would not have, his army wouldn't have been captured and forced to surrender. But instead, Howe went after Philadelphia and he left Burgoyne to his own devices. And the result was that in October of 1777, Burgoyne's army surrendered. So time and again, in the first 3 years of the war, or first 2 years of the war, first 30 months, the British had ample opportunities, I think, to score decisive victories that could have crushed the insurgency, and they just failed to act on the opportunities that they had.
Was there an independence intangible that infused the colonials with an edge that translated to the battlefield? Napoleon always gets credit for every military quotation, but Napoleon supposedly said morale is to material as 3 is to 1. Was that part of the colonial makeup in their soldiery?
Well, I mean, certainly they were fighting for independence. That after the summer of 1776, that was their goal, and that was the shining light that was out there. People wanted to be independent. I think the war starts in April of 75, but independence isn't declared until 15 months into the war. So for the first 15 months of the war, they're fighting to be reconciled with Great Britain, but to be reconciled on America's terms. And the war, I think, during those 15 months radicalized people. And the more radical they became, the more they wanted to break away from Great Britain and gain their independence. But also there's something else involved here. In 1776, the Americans had invaded Canada, and they went in the fall of 75. They were defeated at Quebec. The army is routed when British reinforcements arrive in the spring, and the American army comes limping back into New York. And Congress sent a committee up to look into the situation to see what was going on. Benjamin Franklin was the key figure in that committee that went up to take a look. And essentially what Franklin and his colleagues on that committee said is that this is a rotten situation. The army is undisciplined. The supply system is primitive and chaotic. And the bottom line, though they didn't quite say this, was we can't win this war if it keeps going on like this. And what we probably need is foreign assistance. And while they didn't say that publicly, Thomas Paine did in Common Sense. And Paine argued we have to declare independence in order to get foreign assistance. As long as we're fighting to stay within the British Empire, there's nothing for France or Spain in this. But if we declare independence, and we can get independence, then Britain is going to be weaker, and France and Spain would profit from the British losses. So I think that played into the decision to declare independence. And then once it is declared, then obviously I think people were fighting for something that they had not been fighting for at the beginning of the war. And in a sense, I think it probably did help sustain morale. Morale goes up and down from late 1776, when Washington retreated from New York back across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, a time period that Thomas Paine again called the dark time. And he always referred, as he looked back on it, always referred to it as the dark time. And I think morale was at rock bottom then, and morale sagged again later on in the war. But what did keep morale up, if anything, was the idea that if we win this war, we get away from England, and we have the promise of a brighter future. Paine outlined that future in Common Sense. He said independence would mean peace and prosperity. Peace in the sense that Americans would no longer be dragged into Europe's wars. The American colonists had just fought 4 wars that really were wars between. This was over a period of about 75 years. 4 wars that began in 1689 and continued to 1763. They were really wars between Britain on the one hand and France and Spain on the other, but the colonists got dragged into those conflicts. And so Paine said, look, if we're independent, we're not going to be dragged into those wars. And then he also said independence means prosperity, because we can then trade with whomever we please, whereas Britain is restricting who we can trade with. So it'll mean a much greater prosperity than we've enjoyed in the British Empire. So from that standpoint, I think the idea of fighting for independence did sustain this war effort through good and bad times.
Especially in the early years of the war, was there a talent gap between the British and American generals? And if so, how much did it close, or did it close as the war progressed?
Well, I think there was a talent gap between the armies. Let me put it that way. I don't think General Gage, and certainly not General Howe, were the most talented generals that ever became commanders. But the British had a professional army, and it was a well-supplied army, a well-trained army, a somewhat experienced army. And throughout the officer corps, from generals down through colonels and majors down to the lowest level, these were officers who had some training and they had some experience. And on the other side, the American side, that wasn't the case. The Americans, General Washington was the commander. He had commanded a Virginia army for about 5 years during the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War in the 1750s and 60s. But it was he commanded against Indians. He'd never commanded against a European army. So he really didn't have a great deal of experience, and that was true of most of the other general officers. There were 2 general officers, Horatio Gates and Charles Lee, who had been Richard Montgomery as well, had been veteran British officers who left the British Army and moved over to the colonies before the Revolutionary War. But if you take them out of the picture, the rest of the officers were pretty callow. They maybe some of them had soldiered a bit in the 7 Years' War. Nathaniel Greene, on the other hand, had never soldiered. And John Sullivan from New Hampshire was a general officer. He had never soldiered. They had been in militia. They'd marched around muster fields and training fields, but they had never really soldiered. And the average soldier was a militiaman. Most of them at the outset of this war were young guys, 18, 20, 21 years old, and they had been too young to serve in the 7 Years' War. So the British Army, I think, was a much better army than the Americans had at the outset of the war. Things change as it goes along in two respects. One is that when the war began, the American soldiers enlisted for 1 year, and then almost all of them left as soon as their term of service expired. They had it. They found out that the life of the soldier, especially in wartime, was not the best possible life. There were a lot of dangers involved, and they felt like they had done their duty. Now it's somebody else's turn. And at the end of the first year of the war, Washington went to Congress and he said, look, we can't run the war this way. We can't lose an army at the end of every year and have to recruit another army. But Congress was afraid of a standing army, and it said no to Washington. And then at the end of 1776, the second year of the war, Washington again went to Congress and said, look, we've got to have a standing army. And this time Congress knew that if they didn't do that, they were going to lose the war. They'd come very, very close to losing the war as it was in 1776. And so Congress stipulated that men who came into the army beginning in early 1777 would enlist for 3 years or the duration. That is, they were in for at least 3 years, and if the war lasted longer than that, they were in for a longer period. So I think from 1777 on, the American Army had a cadre of soldiers that were better trained and experienced under fire, and the Continental Army became a much better army. And the same was true of officers who got a good deal of experience in 1775 to 76, and then continued to get more experience as the war went on. One historian argued several years ago that of all of the generals in the war, Washington was the one who grew the most. I think I'd add Nathaniel Greene to that equation too, but I'd certainly say that was true of Washington. He had further to grow than the British officers because he wasn't a professional soldier. Gage and Howe and Clinton had been in the British Army for 30 years or so by the time the Revolutionary War started. Washington, as I said, had only about 5 years' experience with a small Virginia army during the French and Indian War. So Washington had further to go, but he did grow. He learned from the mistakes that he made. He made a lot of mistakes, in fact, in the first couple of years of the war, but he learned from those mistakes, and he became, I think, quite a good general overall. He's been called the indispensable man. And I think he probably was. I don't think anybody else could have been chosen to command the Continental Army who could have done the job that Washington did. Maybe if something had happened to Washington late in the war, if he almost got shot at the Battle of Brandywine in September of 1777. Had he been shot or had he gotten a camp disease or something and died, and he had told Congress that if something happened to him, he wanted Nathaniel Greene to be his successor. And I think by late in the war, Greene might have been able to do as good a job as Washington did. I don't think he could have at the beginning of the war, but he like Washington, grew.
Saratoga is kind of the watershed, perhaps, of not only the war, but of your book. And we're talking with Professor John Ferling. He's written many books on the American Revolution. We're specifically discussing winning independence. Saratoga is, I guess, if you had to come up with a list of the 10 most important battles in American history, I'm assuming Saratoga would be 1 or 2. But I'll leave that up to you. But why didn't Saratoga end the war?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I wrote Winning Independence is that I wanted to tackle the idea that Saratoga is the turning point of the revolution. I think virtually every textbook that's ever been published on American history lists Saratoga as the turning point of the war. But the fact of the matter is, the war goes on for 4 years after Saratoga. And I try to argue in Winning Independence that Britain's defeat was not guaranteed by Saratoga. I don't minimize the importance of Saratoga. The British lost an entire army there, so and it really draws France into the war. So there's two really crucial things that result from Saratoga. But the war goes on and on and on. And by 1781, Saratoga's in October of 1777. And by the beginning of 1781, I try to argue in Winning Independence that Sir Henry Clinton, who was then the commander of the British Army, was more confident at the outset of that year than was George Washington. So it is a crucial factor and point in the war. I don't doubt that in the least. But the war does go on for a long time after that.
One of the things that I took from your book, and especially in your introduction, is that there's so much attention paid to the Northern Theater. That's where the war starts. And I'm talking New York, Massachusetts. You could even throw in Canada. Maybe, let's throw Philadelphia Pennsylvania in there as well. There's so much attention to it. But the war really isn't won or lost by either side in the North. And what struck me was the comparison in my mind. You don't make it in the book, but I made it as I was reading it. And you talk about it, please, and tell me if I'm wrong, to the East-West comparison in the American Civil War, where the Eastern Theater gets so much attention because that's Lee and Lincoln's in Washington, and there are a lot of big battles, famous battles that way, and both capitals are in the East. But the true victors and the Union victory in the entire war, in my view, and I think it's most historians' view, really happens in the West. Vicksburg, Shiloh, you have Grant, Sherman, Sheridan comes out of the West, Chattanooga, the list goes on and on. Is that an apt comparison that one geographic designation gets a lot of the attention, yet the other one may have been more dispositive?
Yeah, sure. I don't disagree with you at all. And in fact, I pondered that. Why was that the case with regard to the Revolutionary War? And I think there probably are two factors involved. One is that Washington wasn't down south until the last second, really. I mean, he only arrives down in Virginia in September of 1781, 3 or 4 weeks before Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. And so I think, just as you said, historians tended to focus on Lee in the East in the Civil War. Historians tended to focus on Washington, and Washington was up north all of the time until 1781 in this war. So I think that was one thing. I think the second thing that happened is that Northern historians just were much more active. There were major colleges and universities in the North in the early part of the 19th century. They had PhD programs and whatever, and so they were writing about the Revolutionary War. There were a couple of people like David Ramsey in South Carolina who wrote early books about the Revolutionary War. But most of what comes out in the 19th century about the Revolutionary War is written by Northerners, and they're looking at the war in the North. They're not that interested in the war in the South. And when Southern historians finally started writing about war, they had another war that they were more interested in, and that was the Civil War, of course. So I think that's probably, at least in my mind, why things worked out that way. And even I live in down in metropolitan Atlanta, and the Revolutionary War doesn't get that much attention down here, even though Georgia was one of the original 13 colonies, and there are two major battles in Savannah during the Revolutionary War. But it's when people think of wars down here, I think they think of the Civil War and then more recent wars, World War II, Vietnam, have I think just overshadowed the interest in the Revolutionary War.
So they choose to emphasize in their pedagogy the fact that Sherman kicked the living hell out of them all the way across the state.
That's
as
right.
opposed. Anyway, you are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, the Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. We are talking with Revolutionary Era historian John Ferling. He's written so many terrific books. We're talking today about his latest, Winning Independence, which chronicles the last years of the war and Britain's switch to a Southern strategy. Let's talk about that for just a second, please. Both philosophers, Helmuth von Moltke, the Prussian general, and Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, came up with kind of the same saying. Moltke's saying was, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Equally brilliant in their own way. But the British decided to drive in a Southern strategy. And I want to ask you first to answer the question, why did they do that? That's A. And B, was it actually ever implemented? We have probably the most famous military plan in all history, the Schlieffen Plan, that the Imperial Germans put together before World War I. And it really wasn't implemented as Schlieffen wanted it to. But did the British get that chance to fully implement their plan? And why did they look south?
Okay, yeah, let me take the first question first, and that is why did they devise the Southern strategy? And it's devised in the aftermath of Saratoga. I mean, imagine the fallout of losing an entire army at Saratoga in October of 1777, and the British, that the news of what had happened at Saratoga reaches London in December of 1777, and immediately two things happen. One is there had all along been an opposition party in Parliament to the war. They thought it was a hopeless situation. The British would lose America, on and on. They had numerous reasons for opposing the war from the beginning. And now that they've lost an entire army 30 months into the war, the opposition forces in Parliament are demanding an end to the war. And then the second thing that happens is Lord North he's the prime minister. He convenes his cabinet, and they begin discussing what are we going to do. And there were some who wanted to just drop out of the war. They thought it was now a hopeless situation. Others wanted to stay in the war but focus on protecting British sugar islands in the Caribbean. Others wanted to at least first offer the Americans some sort of peace plan to see if they could get the Americans to accept a settlement short of independence. And then there's the king, George III, and he's insisting that the war continue. He modifies his thinking a little bit as time goes along, but he never abandons the idea that the war could be won and Britain should continue to pursue crushing the rebellion. And I think because of George III's attitude, the ministry still has a majority in Parliament, and it decides it has to continue the war. But after 30 months, they haven't won the war with their previous strategy, so they have to come up with a new strategy. And the new strategy is really devised by the American secretary. And the American secretary was in effect, he didn't have this title, but he was in effect kind of the war minister for North's cabinet. And that's Lord George Germain. And Germain comes up with the American strategy, the Southern strategy, I'm sorry. And that's what the ministry will embrace. And the idea of the Southern strategy was that, first of all, there was an assumption which historians have generally demonstrated was a correct supposition on Germain's part, that there were more loyalists in the South than was the case up north. Greater percentage of the population remained loyal to England. And I think it was for a whole bevy of reasons, their ties to the Anglican Church and whatever, but mostly I think for economic reasons. The South exported rice and tobacco and whatever to England, made a lot of money off that, made a lot of money off slavery and whatever, and they wanted to stay within the empire. And so Germain said, look, I think there's a chance that we can crush the rebellion in Georgia and in South Carolina, and that if we crush the rebellion in South Carolina, North Carolina will probably be doomed as well. Virginia maybe is a different matter, but there was a real possibility that they could crush the insurgency in 3 southern colonies. And if they did that, Britain, let's say the war would end with the United States gaining independence, but it would be 10 states that were in the United States, because North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, had been crushed, and they were back in the British Empire. The British Empire would have been a pretty impressive empire, even having lost those 10 states. It would have Canada, it would have the area west of the Appalachians, it would have those 3 southern colonies, and Florida, which it had gained in the 7 Years' War, and it would have a whole bevy of sugar islands in the Caribbean. So it would be still a large empire, profitable empire, and it would completely encircle those 10 states in the United States. They wouldn't be able to expand. They would be just cut off. Their quality of life would probably start sinking. Their economy would suffer. And there was a reasonable prospect, I think, if they got those 3 southern states and 3 southern colonies and held on to what else they had possessed all along, there was probably a reasonable prospect that within 15 or 20 years of the war, the United States would say, well, let's let bygones be bygones, and then work out some sort of accommodation with Great Britain, probably something along the lines of the Commonwealth system that developed. And their relationship with Britain might be, say, like Canada's relationship with Great Britain. So I think that was what really was the underlying idea behind Germain's Southern strategy, and the ministry bought into it. They still had a majority in Parliament, and so this is a strategy they're going to pursue. They did. I mentioned that some people really demanded that Lord North offer some sort of peace proposal to the Americans. And what North offered was essentially exactly what the First Continental Congress had demanded on the eve of the war, that American colonies would, for all practical purposes, be independent. That is, they wouldn't be taxed. British laws wouldn't apply here, but they wouldn't be independent in name, and the British could demanded under the peace plan that they would still control American trade within the empire. But the Americans would have been considerably more autonomous than they had been before the war. And that's what Congress wanted on the eve of the war. But the Americans knew that on the one hand, in 1778, they could choose between Lord North's peace plan and stay in the empire, or on the other hand, they could accept an alliance with France, because after Saratoga, France conducted talks with the 3 American commissioners in Paris, and they worked out terms for an alliance and signed it in Paris in February of 1778. And so France's entry into the war, I think Congress thought this guarantees independence. And Washington says that 2 or 3 times in his correspondence in April and May of 1778. We're as good as independent now. I mean, he didn't say it quite in those terms, but that was what he meant, that would, if Britain couldn't defeat America before France came into the war, it certainly couldn't defeat America that was getting assistance from the French. So the Americans rejected North's peace plan, and they accepted the alliance with France.
Interesting that the Loyalist Army, I think in your book, you write 4 times, they keep getting the living hell kicked out of them by their brothers and from who are fighting on the colonial side. So, to the extent that they were helpful, of course, but they just didn't seem to be able to translate that into military success. One of the best parts of your book, actually, I think it's one of the best descriptions of the the privations, the harsh conditions. You discuss it at length in multiple chapters. And before we get on to discussing the year 1781, which I want to bring up, the conditions under which both the British, but especially the Americans, fought and marched and endured is something that you just can't fathom. Even winter in the southern states were particularly harsh. Why did you feel that was an important part of your book and of your research and writings to make sure that the reader understood, do you really have any conception under which the conditions these men fought and lived?
Yeah, I think, soldiering in wartime is a tough go. In the 21st century, 20th century, 19th century, whatever. And in the 18th century, it was a particularly tough go. I mean, they everywhere an army moved, they moved on foot. The officers, maybe highest ranking officers, rode horses, but the men moved on foot. Unlike in World War II or in more recent wars, where troops were conveyed by trucks and even by trains and planes and whatever, but they're moving on foot. And the Americans had just a chaotic supply system. They were just never able to overcome the problems of supplying their army. In part, I think it was primitive because men weren't experienced in that sort of thing. It was difficult because of the primitive technology. I mean, imagine it would have been so much easier if Washington could have gotten on the telephone and called somebody and said, look, we need this or that. But there was always a communications lag. It took about 30 days or more for a letter written by a soldier an officer in the Carolinas to reach New York, for example. Then another 30 days for the response to come back. And there were shortages of things, shortages of horses, shortages of wagons, shortages of provisions of every kind. And one reason there were shortages of food was that the Americans were paying farmers for food with money that from 1777 on was increasingly worthless money, because the American economy, with inflation just running wild, the currency had depreciated and it didn't have any value. And the British, on the other hand, could go to the farmers and say, look, we'll pay you in specie. They'll pay you in good hard currency. And so a lot of the farmers who may have been patriots would sell their goods to the British and not to the Americans. So there were shortages there. And there was corruption. There's always corruption. And there was corruption in the supply system as well. So these people were often deprived. They just didn't have much to eat. What they did eat wasn't very nutritious. Washington at one point mentions that the French had sent over tons of clothing and shoes, and Washington says, I guess they're in a warehouse someplace because we don't have them here. They'd gotten to America, but they didn't get to the army. I mean, some did, obviously, but the men were oftentimes just ill-clad, poorly housed, poorly fed, and it was a tough go. And we now think that nobody knows exactly how many American soldiers died during the war, but I think the best guess is probably about 35,000 died during this war. And of that 35,000, the great majority, probably about 7,000 or or so died as battlefield casualties, but the others died of disease. And it was disease that was brought on in part because they were living in close proximity to one another and they didn't have antibiotics in those days. But partly it was because I think they were probably just immunocompromised because of poor clothing, poor shelter, poor diets, and whatever.
We have just a few minutes left with historian Professor John Ferling, who's written several books on the American Revolution and that period. Let's talk in our last segment, 1781. You make a point in your book, which I'd never really thought of before at all, and that entering the last year of the war, of the last year of fighting, the Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783, but 1781, I think it's fairly can be said that it was the last year of actual true hard fighting. That entering 1781, you had no idea who was going to win, and how that contrasts with 1865 and 1945, when by then it was pretty much no longer in doubt. But 1791 starts out with my favorite battle of all time, my favorite American battle for sure, and that is the Battle of Cowpens, January 17th. It's a brilliant tactical masterpiece by Daniel Morgan, and I think it's not overstating to say that Cowpens is a bit of a direct line that leads to Yorktown 9 months later. Tell us about the Battle of Cowpens and how Lord Cornwallis, ends up losing it all at the Siege of Yorktown on October 19th, 1781.
Sure. The General Greene was the American commander in the South. He's appointed the commander late in 1780. He arrives about December of 1780 in North Carolina, and General Earl Cornwallis is the commander of the British Army in North Carolina, in the South. And Greene does something that's unconventional. He decides to divide his army in the face of a superior adversary. That's the great no-no of warfare.
Right.
But he does that, and he sends Daniel Morgan out to western North Carolina, and Greene stays in eastern North Carolina. And he thinks that Cornwallis can do one of two things. Cornwallis can divide his army and come after each half of the American army, or Greene thought he might come after him, and in that case, Morgan would leave western North Carolina, come over and join Greene for whatever kind of showdown occurred with Cornwallis. But Cornwallis chooses the former option. He divides his army and he goes after Morgan in western North Carolina, and he actually sends Benestra Tarleton, who commanded his cavalry, to go after Morgan, and he catches up with Morgan at Cowpens, and Morgan chooses a strategy that was somewhat unconventional, that he puts his militia in the front ranks. They're going to be the first who face the British as the British advance, and then he puts his more experienced Continentals behind them, and he tells his militiamen, get off about 3 shots, and then after you do that, fall back behind the Continentals, and then behind them, he's placed his cavalry. And I think one reason that Morgan did this, I find Morgan really one of the most fascinating of all of the American commanders during this war. Most of the American commanders came from either pretty wealthy backgrounds as was the case with Washington or Schuyler in New York, for example, or they at least came from sort of upper middle class backgrounds. But Morgan came from a really hard scrabble background. And I think when he saw himself in a lot of these militiamen, they were just like he was when he was first starting out. And he knew that he had been a good soldier, and I think he thought they could be good soldiers. Greene and Washington never really accepted that idea, and they never got as much out of their militiamen as Morgan did. But he had confidence in them, and so it becomes just almost a textbook example of how to wage a battle. As Tarleton moves forward, he encounters the militia who take a pretty big toll of them, and then they come forward against the Continentals. And when they saw the militiamen falling back, they thought the Americans were beginning to panic and retreat. And in fact, just back the previous August, only about 4 months or so before this, in the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, the Americans had broken and run. And Tarleton thought that's what they're doing again, so he charges ahead, and he charges right into the Continentals, who are the militiamen have fallen behind, and then, to his great surprise, across a knoll from behind the Continentals come the American cavalry. And the result is just a devastating defeat inflicted on Tarleton. And not only did the British lose a great many men at Cowpens, but to this point, Tarleton was, I think, the most feared British soldier of all by the Americans. He had perpetrated a massacre in South Carolina after Clinton took Charleston up in the Waxhaws area of South Carolina, and he was greatly feared. But now, I mean, this cuts Tarleton down to size at this point, and the Americans know that they can fight against him and fight against him successfully. And within 2 months, Cornwallis fights another battle against Greene at Guilford Courthouse. And Greene scores another victory there, technically a victory for the British, because they wind up in control of the battlefield, but they lost so many more men than did Greene, men that they couldn't replace, where Greene had a pretty good chance of replacing the men that he lost. And this begins to turn things around. But I don't think really that Cowpens or Guilford Courthouse guarantees, in and of themselves, guarantees that Britain will lose the war or the Americans will win the war. I try to argue that something else happens after Guilford Courthouse and Cowpens that really is the crucial moment in what's going to unfold in 1781.
And that is Battle of the Capes. That is Rochambeau convincing Washington to march south.
Well, all of that,
all the above,
all of that to be sure. But what I'm thinking of is Sir Henry Clinton, and one of the things I tried to do in the book. Sir Henry Clinton is the commander of the British Army from May of 1778 on, and one of the things I tried to do was rehabilitate Clinton's reputation, which has suffered. He did lose at Yorktown, so he lost the war, whatever. But I think he was the best strategist that the British had. And he devised a plan that he thought could successfully carry off the Southern strategy. And his plan was pretty simple. Cornwallis is to stay in the Carolinas and fight against General Greene. And Clinton puts an army in Virginia. First, he sends an army under Benedict Arnold, who's now a British officer. Sends about 1,800 men under Arnold to Virginia in December of 1780. Then he decides it's too small, vulnerable. So he sends a much larger army into Virginia under General William Phillips. So he's got about 6,000 men in Virginia. And their purpose in Virginia is not to crush the insurgency in Virginia, but it's to interdict the flow of supplies to Greene's army down in the South. That supplies, for the most part, the supplies the Americans had came from abroad. And for the most part, they landed in New England, and then they came down through New York and Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, into Virginia, and down through Virginia into the Carolinas. And so Clinton puts this large army there to destroy supply depots and interdict the flow of supplies. That with supplies cut off, Greene's he's going to be like fighting with one arm behind his back, and Cornwallis is to stay in South Carolina and contest it. But Clinton all along feels that what's going to happen in 1781, I mean, he knows that a French army is being sent to America. That's no secret. He's told in March, 6 months before Yorktown, that a French navy is coming to America under de Grasse. He doesn't know where it's going to come. He knows it's got to be probably one of three places. Either that navy's going to come to Charleston and try to retake Charleston, or it's going to come to the Chesapeake and try to crush Cornwallis, or it's going to come to New York. And Clinton feels certain that it will come to New York, that'll be the big prize that the rebels have always looked toward. And so from the beginning, his plan is to pull that army out of Virginia, put 6,000 men there, but he's going to pull 4 of those 6,000 men back to Virginia to defend, out of Virginia back to New York to defend against this French Navy and Washington and Rochambeau's army when they attacked. And he's stopped in his tracks by Germain. Lord Germain writes to Clinton in July of 1781, and he says, "The king and I do not want you to remove one soldier from Virginia." Clinton had already started loading Cornwallis's men on ships at Portsmouth to come back to New York. But he has to follow orders. He can't disobey the orders of the king and Germain. And so he writes to Cornwallis and say, "Okay, stay in Virginia." And I think from that point on, this really is the key decision in 1781. The Cornwallis is there. He's a sitting duck. The French do come to the Chesapeake. Washington and Rochambeau come to the Chesapeake, and Cornwallis is forced to surrender in the siege of Yorktown.
Last question before we get to the final 5 questions we ask all of our guests. Take a minute or two and describe to us what you think was going through George Washington's mind as he received the surrender of the British at Yorktown. First, the British tried to be jerks and surrender to the French, even though they knew Washington was conducting the correspondence. And then they tried to surrender to Washington, but because Cornwallis was sulking in his tent, and he sent his second in command to surrender. Washington pointed him to his second in command, who was Benjamin Lincoln, who was probably having his own little bit of revenge for what had happened to him earlier in the war at the hands of the British. But take us into the mind for just a minute of George Washington, and what do you think, as a man who's written about him, you've written a biography of him, you studied him your whole life, what was he thinking, feeling?
Yeah, I think probably a couple of things. For one, I mean, obviously he's overjoyed at what's happened. I mean, this has been an incredibly long war. He left home in May of 1775 and did not get back to Mount Vernon until September of 1781, just before the siege at Yorktown. So he's been away a long time. He's separated from his wife most of every year. He's had just an incredible array of problems thrown at him year after year, lots and lots of bad times, mutinies in his army, defeats, situations that just seem to be hopeless. And so he obviously, I think, would have felt just incredible joy that this is going to be the decisive victory on the one hand, but joy that the war is now going to end and American independence is virtually guaranteed with the surrender of Cornwallis. But I think the second thing that Washington probably was thinking is, after Saratoga, Gates had scored the great victory at Saratoga over Burgoyne, and Washington at that same moment, the fall of 1777, hadn't done that well at Brandywine. And there were people in Congress, in and out of Congress, who wanted to dump Washington and replace him with Gates. And it was a long, anxious winter for Washington. It wasn't absolutely certain that he was going to survive as commander of the Continental Army. So I think probably one thing he was thinking at Yorktown is, now he's been vindicated. He's been vindicated as a credible general and commander, and he has produced this decisive victory. He always spoke of the Revolutionary War as this glorious cause, and he had now brought this glorious cause to a successful end. So I think probably all of those things were going through Washington's mind.
Now I know where Robert Middlecoff got the title for his book.
Right.
I didn't know until just now. We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor Ferling, are you ready?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
What was your first job?
I guess if you want to go back to when I was in school, it was selling men's clothing at J.C. Penney's in the summertime. But my first teaching job, I started teaching in a high school. I taught for 2 years at a high school in Orange, Texas. I grew up near Galveston, Texas, and I taught for 2 years. I'd gotten my master's degree. I wanted to lay out and just relax. I was tired of school, but I knew I was going to go to on to graduate school. And so I taught for 2 years, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved teaching there. In fact, I loved it so much that in my second year, I thought I better get out of here, because if I don't, I'll probably never get out of here and never get to grad school. So that was my first teaching job.
What was your first concert?
First concert I attended?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Golly. Well, I used to go to the symphony in Atlanta quite a bit. I think it was probably, I'm not sure I can remember the first one, but I think it was the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra playing one of my favorites, Pictures at an Exhibition.
Number 3, if you could choose any book for someone to read, which book would you choose or recommend?
Well, when I don't know, because I mean, I just read so many books, and I'm not sure. Okay, let me answer it this way. When I was in college, I'll give you a roundabout answer. When I was in college, I started college thinking I might want to major in history, and you had to take 4 semesters of required courses. Two in Western Civ, 2 in American history. And they were so incredibly boring that I thought I never want to take another history course in my life. And I was taking the last one, and the professor I was taking fell ill, had to go into the hospital. And so, in the time-honored tradition of ways they ran the low man on the totem pole and to finish the semester. It was a professor who was a freshly minted PhD in history named William Painter. And Dr. Painter said, I don't lecture. Here's go purchase these 5 books. And each day when we meet, you'll read 50 or 75 pages that I assign, and we'll discuss those books. And 2 of the books, I don't remember all 5 of them, but I remember 2 of them. One of them was Alan Bullock's Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. And the other was Marcus Cunliffe's book, George Washington, Man and Monument. And those 2 sort of really turned me around. That and the discussions in class, I had never experienced anything like that before. And before the semester was over, I thought, you know what I'd really like to do is I'd like to write books like these guys. And I went into Dr. Painter's office and I said, how do you write books? I mean, do you have to be a man of means to do this? And he said, hell no, you teach in college. And so when I walked out of his office, I knew 2 things. I wanted to go to graduate school so I could teach in college, and I wanted to write books. So in a sense, those 2 have been the most influential to me. There are other books on Hitler that I would recommend now rather than Bullock's book, but I would still recommend Marcus Cunliffe as a book. Maybe not the most important book that I've ever read, but certainly it was influential in my life.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
Well, let me tell you, in November of 1963, I was teaching in a high school in Texas, as I said. And my closest friend was working in Dallas. And he called me on the phone and he said, look, Kennedy's coming to Dallas next weekend. Why don't you come up? We'll go to the parade and see Kennedy. And then SMU is going to play Baylor on Saturday. We'll go to that football game. I'd gone to school at Baylor. And I thought, well, the only way my principal will never let me do this. And so I'd have to go in and lie to my principal about why I was going to miss school. And I was afraid to do that. It was the first year of my first job teaching. And so I didn't go to Dallas. My friend didn't see the assassination. He was at the other end of Dallas. And we did see Kennedy in the motorcade. And I guess if I could be present at any event, because I have been sort of a bug on the assassination ever since. I think I would have liked to have been in Dealey Plaza and seen that event.
I don't know if you're a podcast listener, but if you are, I will send you the link to the podcast interview I did with Clint Hill.
Oh, sure. Yeah. The Secret Service.
Yeah. Last question. If
Yeah.
you could have dinner.
And let me mention, when you go back to important books, I don't know that I think this is the most important book ever written, but I think it's the very best book on the Kennedy assassination is one that came out only about a year or so ago by Josiah Thompson, called Last Second in Dallas. And I think he comes closer to unraveling what happened in the shooting than anybody else who has examined that.
I'll have to look that up. I appreciate it. Maybe I can get him on the podcast. I'll drop your name.
Yeah.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours completely off the record to talk about anything you choose, whom would you like to sit down with? Living today.
Maybe somebody like Dan Rather, who
Speaking of Dallas, November 22nd, 1963.
Right. Mm-hmm. And he and I went, I'd never met Dan Rather, but he and I went to the same undergraduate school, State College in Texas. And, but he was a newsman. He covered lots of events, lots of personalities. It would be interesting, I think, to pick his mind off the record and see what he had to say. So maybe someone like him, I think.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been John Ferling, an absolutely terrific writer, if I may say. I'm so happy I have a collection of your books. They have all been terrific, and we very much appreciate your time today. Your latest, called Winning Independence, which chronicles the last years of the Revolutionary War, really is a thinker. Brought up several things I'd never thought about before, and does so in just terrific style. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Robert, for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.